This is the CFF Sites Week 8 College Fantasy Football Show. I am your host, Joe DeSalvo, and we're coming out of Week 7. And again, college football doesn't disappoint. Great weekend of football once again. Texas takes down Oklahoma. Indiana goes on the road and wins in Eugene. USC takes down Michigan. Georgia survives Auburn. Washington State nearly trips up Ole Miss in Oxford. And of course, the nail in the coffin for James Franklin with Northwestern beating Penn State. Again, what a weekend of college football. The season has not disappointed. College fantasy football, I can't say the same. There have been a bunch of disappointments. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into some good stuff too, right? We can't forget that. I mean, for as much, here's something interesting that I haven't seen talked about a lot, and that is, with so much attention being given to guys that have gone from the G5 conferences now to the power conferences, we highlight every week, especially I see it in the Discord all the time, about the guys that haven't hit. But what about some of the guys that have, right? I mean, look, just throwing a couple out, Ahmad Hardy, Terrence Carter over at Texas Tech. There are some guys that have really shined moving from G5 conferences, even to FCS level. Danny Scudero as well, even though that's not a power conference. But there's been a number of good stories too for guys that have transferred from lower conferences into the power conferences. You just have to look for them, but so much attention is given on the disappointments that sometimes we forget about the shining light. So real quick before we get into the show, want to give a shout out to the 4-in-1 Super Fantasy League. The Eliminator now is moving into, I think, the top 48. The head-to-head league is now in the middle of the tournament. We've got the two halves tournament is in the second half. The back end tournament now. So all of the formats in full motion, and of course the total points league where it's the season cumulative total. And I'll give a shout out to the top five coming in number one right now, sitting 12.7 points ahead of second place is Joe Chimo. ND Base 2001 is second, followed by Gulf Coasters. And then B Citica 31 in the fourth spot, and Joe Haddocks in the fifth spot. So shout out to the top five. Just want to taking a look at this real quick in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. I'm looking at the 103 points separates first from 10 right now. So wide open in the total points league. Can make one big week, can really jump you up in the standings. So super shout out to you guys in the 4-in-1 Super Fantasy League. But let's get into the week that was, week 7. And I'll just kind of go in the order of the games. Look, we're getting games now Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. We're getting football between college and pro every day of the week. Here's what I would tell you. The Tuesday games now are in full swing. The Wednesday games in full swing. I don't particularly like the Tuesday and Wednesday games. As a content creator, it is a little bit of a pain in the butt. As a fan, I get it. I know that you guys want to be able to watch college football every day of the week, and so you get a chance to scratch that itch. And here's the thing: it just creates a lot of work on our back end as well. Usually try to get the projections up. We have a Thursday goal. We've been good at getting them up there on Wednesday every week. Tuesday game, we usually try to get the projections up for the Tuesday, Wednesday games before all the other projections if we cannot get the full slate of games for the weekend up in time. But we worked overtime this week. We got everything up, including I put my top 25 rankings up there, and those could move around a little bit because I tried to get everything up early for you guys that may have any Tuesday, Wednesday players, just to give you guys some comparables. But we worked overtime, got the projections up, got the rankings up, and now it's all about getting out this show, and then we've got Mike's DFS write-ups to come later on in the week. So here we are, week 8, very important week because now this kind of starts the back stretch, right? Weeks 8, 9, 10, because I always say as you get into double digit weeks, that's when everything goes under the microscope and every move matters. I would argue every move matters now, but as you get into weeks 10, 11, and 12, 13, 14 of playoff weeks, or 12, 13, 14 of playoff weeks. So As you creep closer to the double digit weeks, as I like to say, that's when it starts to be do or die, and you start hanging on a thread with every little decision that you make. But let's go ahead and take a look at week 7. And like I said, we'll go in the order of the games. And just to kind of throw it out there lightly, and we'll start in the group of 5 conferences. And I just want to reference UTEP because you have Malachi Nelson there. I mean, one theme that we've talked about this year throughout some of the shows is how some of the highly recruited quarterbacks have just been misses, not only this year, but over the past couple of years. Malachi Nelson, remember, he was one of the top recruited quarterbacks in the country. Recruited by Lincoln Riley at USC, goes to USC, leaves USC, goes to Boise State, couldn't win the job there, goes to UTEP, and was replaced this past week because of performance issues. And just makes you wonder, is that it for Malachi Nelson? Does he have another step? Will he finish his career at UTEP? But I mean, wow, what a fall for grace from some of these guys that are highly recruited coming out of high school. Now, turning our attention to more fantasy relevant news, when you look at Tulane, okay, remember at the beginning of the year, Maurice Turner had that big week 1. There was a lot of, questions of who was going to be running back 1 at Tulane, especially given what Mekhi Hughes did last year. We know the Mekhi Hughes story this year at Oregon, and he left. And of course, he's not playing this year anymore. But Javon Gordon seems like he's taken over that running back 1 role at Tulane, the freshman. The last 2 weeks, 30 touches, 25 rush attempts, 5 receptions. Last 2 games, 30 touches, not bad. If he can pick up that volume, then I think we could, and I'm not saying we are, we could be looking at a nice fantasy asset for the home stretch of the college fantasy football season. So pay attention to Javon Gordon. Tulane looks like he may have emerged as the running back 1 in there, given his performance over the last 2 weeks. And last week, he kind of got that cheap touchdown at the end receiving. Remember, we don't care how you get the touchdowns as long as you get them. Now, we go over to Jacksonville State, and I can look, Cam Cook, one of the top running backs on our board this week, one of the top running backs in projections, 20 plus rush attempts in each of the last 5 games. I've always said, if you've followed the site for years and you've listened to me for years, I love high volume backs. Cam Cook, poster board for the high volume back. Let's go over to USM because they were playing. They didn't play on Saturday either. They played, I think it was the Thursday or Friday game. Jeffrey Pittman, the last 2 games, 49 rush attempts, 220 yards, 4 touchdowns. So now it looks like we have another fantasy factor in that offense besides quarterback Braylon Braxton, and that's running back Jeffrey Pittman right now. As we stay in the Sun Belt, we've got Georgia Southern. We've got wide receiver Camden Brown, one of our top receivers on the board this week. 3 straight games with 100-plus yards receiving. Really good momentum going in his way if you have receiver Camden Brown. Talk about momentum. South Florida quarterback Byron Brown, 14 touchdowns he's accounted for in the last 3 games, 11 passing, 3 rushing. And I just think back to last year. I remember doing the show, and I think we were in week 4, week 5, where Byron Brown was out. He got injured at the beginning of the year, and there was talk that he was coming back. And I was like, man, look at that schedule. He's going to be golden down the second half of the season. Byron Brown, he was one of the top quarterbacks on the board last year. Him and Caden Salter, remember, both of those 2 guys bottomed out. Byron Brown more so because of injury. He never did return. But boy, is he cooking now this year. 14 touchdowns the last 3 games, and he's doing now what we projected he would do last year until he got hurt and was out for the season. Now, on last week's show, I threw out that Old Dominion was a sneaky good Sun Belt team. I talked about how maybe the Marshall game with the game coming up against James Madison was a little bit of a trap game for Old Dominion. It played out that way. Marshall handled Old Dominion pretty good. Okay. Now, here's what I would say. Colton Joseph still does Colton Joseph things. He did so last week, maybe not at the level that we thought, but he didn't disappoint last week. So he still gave you a solid outing. But the one thing that I think is important to note is that Carlos Del Rio Wilson has pretty much established himself as a top fantasy quarterback option right now over at Marshall. I mean, if you think back, remember Marshall, the coach, went over to Southern Miss. A lot of the players followed. Marshall was starting over. Man, what a great job Marshall has done in rebuilding that team after they've lost half the roster last year. And Carlos Del Rio Wilson now looks like a fantasy star. 15 touchdowns he's accounted for in his last 4 games. Again, I think one of the top 10 quarterbacks on my board this week. Now, as we talk about turnarounds, we can go right into Stanford and transition into Stanford. I remember watching Stanford at the beginning of the year and thinking, this has to be one of the worst offenses in all power conference football. Stanford just looked bad. I think they opened up with that loss against Hawaii. They just did not look good at all. And now they're opening it up. CJ Williams, wide receiver CJ Williams, 40 targets in the last 3 weeks. Tight end Sam Roosh, 16 targets in the last 2 weeks. Let's see what happens this week. Remember, I said, hold on, and where can I find it? I remember I said last week, we didn't want to judge Mason Heitzel, the freshman quarterback from Pitt, off of that one performance that he had. We said, let's give him a week. Let's see what he does against Florida State. He throws for 321 yards and 2 touchdowns against Florida State, and he rushes for 64 yards in that game. And now he's on the fantasy radar too, right? I remember somebody in Discord, I remember who it was. I said, hey, get after this kid. He's the real deal. Right now, after 2 games, Mason Heitzel looks like the real deal. But the reason why I bring that up is because Stanford gets Florida State. Florida State's got to go all the way across the country, play Stanford. Florida State right now has this conference losing streak, but this is one of those games where it looks like, man, Florida State should dominate this game, but will they? And if Pitt threw the ball against them last week, there's nothing that makes me think that they'll be able to at least shut down Stanford. So I think Williams and Roush will get their targets this week, and I think they're safe plays this week. Now, their ability to score points, that's another question. But especially in PPR leagues, I think you've got to go with those two guys. They look like good options against a Florida State defense that struggled last week, and it looks like a recalibrated Stanford offense. Now, I want to talk about a G5 player that completely jumps out, and it's wide receiver Cam Perry at Miami of Ohio, right? Like, if you followed Maction, you've been a full FBS college fantasy football guy for the last few years, you know that Miami of Ohio is good for a receiver every year. And while I don't think we have that consistent 6 to 8, 100-yard guy every week, Cam Perry is doing some things unbelievably right now. In 6 games, he's averaging 30.9 yards per reception. He's only catching about 2 to 3 passes a game. So he kind of feels like that boom or bust pick. But man, the guy leads the team in receiving. He leads the team, I think, in receptions, and he's averaging 30.9 yards per reception. Curious to see if he can keep that up. That is an ungodly amount of yards per catch. Just want to throw that on the radar just to see where Cam Perry ends the year as we move through MAC play now. Now, UCLA. Remember, I think I said last week, or I might have put it in my notes and observations, I wasn't going to be quick to jump on UCLA, even in that win over Penn State, because we needed to see it again, and we did get it again against Michigan State. This week, UCLA hosts a Maryland team that just gave up 30 plus to Nebraska, right? So you got UCLA with the win against Penn State. You've got the win against, Michigan State. And then they get Maryland this week. And Nico Iamaleava, 8 touchdowns now in the last 2 games. And I think we need to start taking him serious as a quarterback 2 option in 2 quarterback leagues. Let's see how UCLA looks against this Maryland team. But I think that you're okay starting him if you feel like that you have to, given the matchup, right? Now, where the risk isn't worth the reward, let's go to Oklahoma State, because there was a feeding frenzy on the waiver wire for wide receiver Sam Jackson V, because it was announced, remember, He was a quarterback converted. He was a converted receiver from quarterback, right? That he was going to get the start for Oklahoma State this past week. And my personal feeling when these type of things happen, because I've seen these type of moves win college fantasy football leagues in the past. However, that was a situation where you needed to get Sam Jackson off the waiver wire and stash him for a week just to see what happens, and then you know that you have a golden egg, right? But here's what happened. He laid an egg instead of having the golden egg. And if you took the chance on starting Sam Jackson last week, he finished with 84 passing yards, negative 28 rushing yards, and an interception. In some leagues, he may have given you a net of negative points. And that's why you got to be careful on going out on a limb and taking and taking these chances, particularly at this point in the season when every game is crucial. That's a type of player, that's a type of move where you stash him on the roster, and if it works in your favor, you're like, I've got it. But if it fails that first, like I wonder how many people started Sam Jackson and then lost the league by like 10, 12 points because they didn't start another receiver instead of Sam Jackson. So just kind of stow that one away. If it happens again, remember this philosophy. That's a pick up and stash move until you see if it's going to bear any fruit. Okay. I already talked about Pitt quarterback Mason Heichel against Florida State, 64 rushing yards, 321 yards, 2 touchdowns on the heels of that 323-4 performance against Boston College. Guy looks legit. Gets Syracuse this week. Should have another big week. Let's go to Alabama. And so much attention has been given to the Alabama passing game that, and I know I mentioned this on the show last week, but the running game now coming along. Jam Miller, 16, 22, and 20 rush attempts in the last 3 games. He's a legitimate fantasy back, and if he can get into the end zone with regularity, I think he's going to be a fantasy factor as we move into the back end of this season. Now, who's becoming a big fantasy factor? Air Force quarterback Liam Zarker. 4 straight games of 100 yards rushing. And you know what's interesting? We're talking about an Air Force quarterback. He's got 8 passing touchdowns in the last 4 games. He's doing it in the air and he's doing it running. And he right now he's projected one of the top 3 quarterbacks, I believe, for week 8. He was one of the top 3 quarterbacks in week 7. And the way that Air Force plays defense, which they don't really have much right now, it looks like they're going to be having this. It looks like they're going to have to chase. And right now, if you have Liam Zarka, you have to feel really good at the quarterback position. Now, talk about a quarterback position in doubt. I mentioned the Penn State loss to Northwestern. Drew Aller, season likely over. All of a sudden now, for you Penn State fans, it looks like Ethan Grunkemeyer steps in at quarterback. And what's his gift in his first game? He gets the Iowa defense. And the reason why I bring up this matchup is now I'm wondering if Iowa defense now is a play against this Penn State offense. And so that's a thought as we move into the weekend. Now, let's go over to Notre Dame because I feel something happening over there at Notre Dame where at the beginning of the year you had Jeremiah Love, you had Jadarian Price, and it was the 1-2 punch. They were both getting that 50-50 feel. I feel like as the season's getting a little bit longer in the tooth, there's a little bit more of a movement to get Jeremiah Love more touches than Jadarian Price. I don't know if it's the way the game's unfolding, but it feels to me there's just a little bit more of a movement to get Jeremiah Love more touches than Price. And that's why you're seeing Jeremiah Love at the top of the rankings and the top of the projections in each of the last 2 weeks. And you know what? He's producing. Now, let's talk about Texas-Oklahoma game because that was really the next one on my list. I mean, both defenses I think were ranked in my top 25, rightfully so. You know, here's the one thing that I say. We've beaten up Arch Manning quite a bit. For his average or below average or pedestrian as Arch Manning has looked, Texas's defense continues to be elite. And it was the Texas defense why they probably or could have beaten Ohio State on the road. Remember, Texas was stuffed at the goal line against Ohio State. They scored that touchdown. Who knows what happens in that game? The Texas defense is very legit. They kept them in that game. Texas could have beaten Ohio State on the road. Now, Texas, we saw the problem is that your defense that's sometimes going to give up points. The offense has to score. Arch Manning didn't look good against Florida, but the defense came through once again in that matchup against Oklahoma, and the special teams came through for Texas. And right now, the best fantasy player right now for Texas is probably the Texas defense special teams. Now, Texas, Oklahoma, Indiana, Oregon. It's kind of that 1-2 in the conversation. Two really good games. And what can you say about Kurt Signetti? Listen, I don't really have anything to say from a fantasy football standpoint other than what a win by Indiana. What a win for their program. They go into Oregon and win that game. Man, props to Indiana, props to you fans at Indiana. And I just look when you look at Mendoza, you look at Surratt, and maybe and to some extent Omar Cooper. Like you come out of that matchup, and it's like, how can you not start them every week? Like you just feel like they're solid fantasy starts. You know, will Mendoza give you the 30 to 35 every week that you're going to get out of some of those other names that I mentioned? No, but he's got one heck of a floor, and he's going to give you solid numbers every single week. And if the rest of your roster is built around him, solid options right there for at Indiana. And again, what a win! And I'm curious to see what kind of run Indiana makes in the Big Ten the rest of the year. Now, one thing that happened this past week, we got news that could change the balance for a lot of people at the running back position, and that is the injury to Texas A&M running back Le'Veon Moss. Reuben Owens kind of had the feel that he was taken over at running back one for the Aggies. Well, if you listen to our preseason shows that Mike and I do, we talk about every year how you don't wish injury on anyone, but sometimes injuries will turn the tables on what happens in college fantasy football, particularly in a backfield that's split, right? So Le'Veon Moss goes down. Reuben Owens now the clear-cut running back one. Would not shock me if Reuben Owens starts getting 18 to 22 touches on a regular basis for the next 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, almost think about this, right? You think about this like with Notre Dame. What if Price or Jeremiah Love went down? The other guy's probably going to get 20 to 25 touches on any given week. That's the situation we're in right now with Reuben Owens, who, for me, ranks as a top 10 fantasy back, running back this weekend because of that injury to Le'Veon Moss. He's going to shoulder the load in that backfield. And I think Reuben Owens is a must start in college fantasy football circles this week. Now, one player that played A&M at the beginning of the year and went lights out was a G5 conference player, Robert Henry. Remember Robert Henry? He went off like 140 plus, maybe 150 against Texas A&M in the opener. I think he started the season with maybe 4 straight 100-yard games. He's been held in check. He's been under 100. I think maybe held under 70 in each of the last 2 games. We were careful not to over project him this week, but this could be a bounce back week for him. But they do travel to North Texas, which has been pretty good this year. So it makes, there's a little bit of caution with Robert Henry. He did find the end zone, I believe, last week on a touchdown reception. I think you're still okay starting him. Hopefully he can have a bounce back week. After the first 4 weeks, it looks like he was going to challenge to be one of the best fantasy backs in the country this year. He's cooled off considerably over the last 2 weeks. I think it was Will Henderson that had 5 touches for a lot of yards last, maybe even, I'm not sure, I think maybe went over 100 yards and a couple of touchdowns, but Henderson took some value away from him last year. But I think Robert Henry's still going to get the touches. Let's see what he does against North Texas. I'm hoping for a bounce back week for you guys. Now, a player that has not started well and continues to not do well was the number one preseason running back on the board, Darius Taylor. Remember, we lost him in the first game of the year to a hamstring injury. He pulled up at the half-yard line, the 1-yard line. He came out of that game. He's played 4 games. He has not scored a touchdown this season. Minnesota hosts Nebraska. Now, of course, my Huskers are playing. I'm probably going to break him out of that slump because he's probably going to find the end zone against my Huskers. But Darius Taylor, no touchdowns in the 4 games he's played so far this season. And at this point, I'm not sure that he's even a must. I don't think he's a must start, and I'm curious to know how many players or how many fantasy owners may have even dropped him. I don't think that happened. You've got to hold on to that player, I think, because you know the potential in that offense if he can turn it around. But I just don't have a lot of confidence in starting Darius Taylor right now. I'd venture to say he's on a bench. He's on the bench on a lot of rosters, and I wouldn't even be surprised if some guys in redraft leagues have already dumped him. Now, we talked about the injury situation with Le'Veon Moss and Reuben Owens. Let's talk about Michigan because right now Justice Haynes is questionable for this week's matchup against Washington, which I think could be a pretty decent game. The reason why this injury is significant is because if Haynes is questionable, or, let's just say he tries to go and is not at 100% but gives it a go, I think it devalues both Haynes and it devalues Jordan Marshall. I'm wondering if Haynes is on the shelf this week. If he doesn't play, that might be the best case scenario for a lot of you fantasy owners. And maybe Jordan Marshall steps into that starting role. And for me, like I did the top 25 rankings, I've got Justice Haynes ranked at 25. I didn't want to put him at top 10 because he's just questionable to play, right? But if you looked at my top 25 rankings and you see Justice Haynes at 25, you see the question mark, the Q next to him, meaning he's questionable. If Justice Haynes is ruled out of that game, Jordan Marshall is a must start, I think, against Washington this Saturday. So keep tabs on that injury as we get closer to the weekend. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to bring up Auburn because I'm going to bring up Jackson Arnold. First of all, let me just say this: you know, watching Auburn this year, there were a couple of plays that probably could have turned their season around. I felt that they kind of got hosed on the scoop and score on that pass and fumble again at Oklahoma. They scored that touchdown. It's a different game, and I feel like this quarterback sneak that they had with Jackson Arnold, it looked like he was clearly over the goal line, and how they didn't get a touchdown for that, I just don't know. To me, those were just two really bad calls. Then you got the trick play that Oklahoma ran that should have been reviewed, should have been a penalty, and that never got called as well. But here's what I would say: even though they've gotten hosed, I think badly, and it probably cost them a couple of games. Jackson Arnold really has cost them the couple of games because even with the missed scoop and score against Oklahoma, even with the missed penalty that didn't get called because of that trick play, the deceiving trick play that they tried to run, Jackson Arnold missed Cam Coleman wide open in the end zone in that game against Oklahoma that would have given them the lead late in the third quarter, possibly given them the lead and maybe winning that game. Also, even though it might have been a bad call and it was a fumble at the goal and it looked like Jackson Arnold crossed the goal line, Jackson Arnold still fumbled that ball and left it in question. And there was another play in this game where he missed Eric Singleton down the field, what looked like could have been a touchdown as well. Jackson Arnold, for me, I don't know how he's still the starting quarterback. I'm curious if guys still have him on the roster, and I'm really curious if we're going to get a chance to see Deuce Knight. Um, I don't know where this is going at Auburn, but I just know that Jackson Arnold ain't it. And if I were in a keeper league, obviously a dynasty league, Deuce Knight's, probably already taken. But I'm wondering if you have deep rosters, if you try to go ahead and just go get Deuce Knight this week, just in case maybe this is Jackson Arnold's last hurrah. Maybe Deuce Knight gets a call. Who knows what'll happen? But sometimes those are the moves that you can make down the line. You just get ahead of it, right? We've seen a lot of coaches now get fired, and you just know that Hugh Freeze is on the hot seat, and you just wonder, does he have to shake some things up to get it moving? And I'm just wondering if we're going to see that change maybe sometime in this game. Don't know. Spent too much time on this because it's not a fantasy factor right now. But Jackson Arnold was one of those quarterbacks. If in the first game of the year against Baylor, he looked like he was going to be lights out this year, and now it looks like, for me, he's not going to be a power conference quarterback once when he's done at Auburn. But Texas Tech, different story. Texas Tech, Big 12 title contenders, and Texas Tech has looked good. What Texas Tech has going for them, I think they have depth. They have depth at receiver. They have depth at running back, and they have depth at quarterback. Even when Baron Morton goes down, they have Will Hammond that can step in at quarterback. It looks like Baron Morton's going to be back. Here's the one thing that I want to throw out there. At running back, Cameron Dickey, you've got Cameron Dickey, you've got Jacoby Williams as well. I've seen enough to know Cameron Dickey to me is the real deal. And here's what I feel. I didn't think, and I mentioned this in my notes and observations, I didn't think that we were going to get that high volume back in the Texas Tech offense this year, as we saw it with Taj Brooks the last few years. But the more Texas Tech legitimizes themselves as Big 12 title contenders, and the more they have to win these games week in and week out, the more they're going to lean on their playmakers. And for me, Cameron Dickey has clearly separated himself as running back one in that Texas Tech backfield. He's got good volume the last 2 weeks. And for me, there's no reason why Cameron Dickey will not continue to get a heavy workload, a lot of touches. And that's why I have him ranked in my top 5 running backs this week. He scores every week. He sometimes gives you 2 touchdowns, and he's a big play running back, as we saw last week, went over 200 yards in that game against Kansas. Now, South Carolina, I've already mentioned this. Again, it's kind of like let's beat up the quarterbacks a little bit. Lenoris Sellers, remember last year, the head coach, after they beat Clemson, was saying that he was the best quarterback in the country, and a lot of us were really buying it. South Carolina looks bad. Lenoris Sellers looks average at best. And that South Carolina team, they host Oklahoma this week. I can't imagine at this particular point many people, unless they're in keeper leagues, are holding on to Lenore Settlers. And then one more game I want to talk about before we close out the show, and that's Arizona State. Remember that game last week? Arizona State, I think, who was it? They were playing Utah, right? Rain, there was going to be rain. They were preparing all week. Remember, quarterback Sam Levitt was throwing wet balls. Well, Sam Levitt doesn't wind up playing. It was interesting because somebody put in the Discord, "Are we going to start Jordan Tyson this week?" And somebody made a comment. I wish I could give you a shout out. I know who you are, but I'd start Jordan Tyson. I forget what the guy said. If it was storming, raining, and my grandmother was the quarterback, because they're just going to find him a way to get the ball. Sure enough, the guy had 8 receptions. I think he only had like 40, 45 yards, but he got the only touchdown. He got it on a rush attempt. And that's the one thing that's good about having elite college fantasy football players. You just never bench them, right? There's just some guys that are matchup proof, and you feel like, it's the Jeremiah Smiths, it's the Jordan Tysons. They're just going to find a way to get the stars the ball. And Jordan Tyson, like, who else gets touches through the air than Jordan Tyson? It feels like he gets 85% of the target. So even if he's targeted 20 times, he's still going to still find a way to come down with 8 or 10 of those. So that's going to do it. That's going to wrap up week 7. We go into week 8. Another good weekend of football. We've got Louisville playing Miami this weekend. I think that game could be sneaky good. LSU travels to Vanderbilt. LSU, to me, hasn't really been too impressive. I think Vanderbilt can take them down. You've got Washington traveling to Michigan. Is Michigan reeling a little bit? I don't know. I think that could be a good game. Michigan probably wins a close one. Baylor TCU, to me, that's the college fantasy football delight in the power conferences. Much like I think the Friday night matchup between Utah State and San Jose State is a college fantasy football delight game for full FBS folks. You've got Ole Miss now traveling to Georgia. Both teams survived after last weekend. Sneaky good matchup in the Sun Belt with Old Dominion James Madison. You've got Texas Tech traveling to Arizona State. Hopefully Sam Levitt can come back. Will Texas get tripped up at Kentucky this week after that big win against Oklahoma? You got Tennessee at Alabama. I think that 8.5 is too much. I think that game's going to be a lot closer than a point spread. And of course, Florida State traveling out west, trying to win an ACC game over Stanford. Let's see how this plays out. College football, the season has not disappointed. A lot of those games that I mentioned, chances are we're going to get some fantastic finishes. But good luck to everyone this week. Good luck with all your lineup choices. Every choice and every move you make is now twice as important as it was 3 or 4 weeks ago. So everything to come. The projections are up. The rankings are up. Mike's available in the Discord. I'm in and out of the Discord. He's got the DFS write-ups coming for all of you DFS guys. But everybody playing college fantasy football, good luck in week 8. And I'll see you next week. Till then.